Now, the global markets got a real tizzy this week because with the terrorist act in London, it's got terror back on the headlines again, and the constant thought of immigration and migration problems facing all the European nations. Now, even though if you read behind the headlines, it tells you that the man who did this act was a born British citizen, nobody pays attention. His name was Islamic or Arabic or Middle Eastern, let's say, to be fair. And that's all people are perceiving. And it just heightens the fear of the migration and the open borders through the EU. So what is happening is it's bringing this debate back into the French elections, and it's helping the support those candidates that are pro closing the borders. And this means it's an anti-European movement. Okay. Now, we have the French elections coming up in April of this year. And as we're watching them unfold, everybody is getting a little bit worried. Now, the French will go to polls, and they vote twice, in April and May this year, to pick their new president. And the world will be watching to see just how far the populist wave has traveled. After the surprise of Britain's Brexit referendum, which has also been in the news because now it's going to be triggered on the 29th. Okay, now this signals an official leaving of the UK from the EU. First time that's going to happen, and it's stressing out all of the Eurozone because now they're having to deal with this one reality as other nations are starting to think how they might leave. And this is going to be, whatever happens here, is going to be the format for future countries deciding to leave the EU. So the EU is very cautious because they don't want to set an example, but they're building a template. So right now, everybody's watching Donald Trump, who upset the markets in surprise and has upset the world, who never thought he could win, and slid in on this populist movement. And France will choose a lot. There's a lot of things being thrown at the headlines right now. The top four candidates in this election are Francis Fillon, and I don't speak French, so I'll try to get them as accurate as possible. Benoit Hamon, Marie Le Pen, who is getting and growing in popularity, and Emmanuel Macron. And there is no clear winner at this stage. Political scandals, distrust of polls, and the recent shock of the Brexit result in Britain and Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. means all bets are off. There is no rhyme or reason. There is no how politics were. It's now how politics will be in the future. So the election will take place in April and May. Now the candidates are voted on, a little bit strange, they're voted on twice. There's a first round of votes that takes place on April 23rd, and then the two top candidates face each other on a runoff on May 7th. French elections always take place on a Sunday. Now, French elections are usually a two-horse in between the conservative and the left-wing Socialist Party. But this year, all bets are off. Francois Hollande's Socialist Party is in tatters after a disastrous term that he has made one of the least popular presidents of the nation. So he's not even leading a strong party into the elections. So we can see at this point, Le Pen is all the way down in 1, 2, 3, 4th place. Macron is in the forerun. Fillon is in second, and Hamon is in third. But that's changing very, very, very quickly. And what's happened is Francois Fillon, who was looking to maybe take the lead, has been hit with all kinds of scandals. Okay. And it keeps going on, and it looks like he's being indicted. Okay. And so therefore, it's craziness. Only one candidate has made it to the second round, and that was Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002. And his daughter, Marie, is virtually assured of doing so. Current polls suggest but her chances of winning the runoff might remain very unlikely. So there's a good chance she'll be in one of the top two positions, but will not win the candidacy. But we can't tell this, and she is very opinionated. So now what happened to throw all the craziness in there is Francois Fillon went under formal investigation. So he is formally being investigated now for criminal activity, okay, which just popped up 2 weeks ago during these elections. So the right-wing French president candidate Francois Fillon has been placed under formal investigation for misuse of public funds. Fillon is alleged to have given his wife and children generous fake jobs funded by the taxpayers as parliamentary assistants. And to compound this, his kids actually gave back money to the government last week. Well, it's a little bit late after you ripped everybody off, gotten caught, and are running for the presidency to start trying to fix your ways. He becomes the first major candidate to run for France's highest office while under formal investigation for misusing state's money. So it's really a very strange thing, and he's still holding on to his second place position. Under French law, being put under formal investigations means that there's a serious and consistent evidence that points to a probable involvement in a crime. So how they're letting him continue to run when he could place in those April 23rd elections and then get indicted criminally or being put on trial for criminal charges. It's a very, very strange way. It is a step towards a trial, but investigation can be dropped without proceeding to court. But in this case, the evidence is so strong that where it's going to go, we don't know. Fillon has refused to step down as a candidate. Polls show he could risk being knocked out of the first round vote in April behind far-reaching Marine Le Pen. Okay, this would bring Marine Le Pen and Marsan into the two final places. Voters in many countries choose their national leaders by going to the polls once. In France, the most consequential election in decades, citizens will have to cast their votes 4 times. It's not just the 2 rounds of presidential elections, concluding in May, that will determine the country's direction. A new legislature will also be chosen over the next 2 rounds of voting in June. Only then will we have a clear picture of who is going to be running France. So it gets really confusing, and you can't even start monitoring the polls as we get closer, with the nationalist Marine Le Pen promising to hold a referendum to take France out of the euro. Now, Le Pen is doing everything she can to lead a populist movement. And I mean, just today alone, she just met with Russia's Putin, and today alone she came out and said if she wins, she would start opening up relations with Russia very, very quickly. Okay. So she's trying to capitalize on everything and anything she can. Now, investors are focusing on the mechanics of the election process and the constitutional checks and balances that will constrain the next head of state. Now, the thing is, the president of France doesn't have that much power. Okay. There are certain points that they have power, and there are also certain times that they have power. So it's going to be very complicated how much authority they have to do this, but they can lead these movements. Now, voters pick their heads of state every 5 years in a direct election in which every vote has equal weight. In theory, a candidate can win on the first ballot, and in practice, the election has always gone to a second round, generally 2 weeks later. This year, presidential voting will be held on April 23rd and May the 7th. Polling stations will close between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. local time, and the results usually become clear before midnight. So there is a balance of power at the top of the French state. The president has executive power, but can't govern the nation without the support of the prime minister and the cabinet, who are needed to pass legislation and approve spending. So the president doesn't have that much authority. It's like the U.S. where Trump can want to do things. He has a certain authority to do these executive actions, but otherwise it all becomes down to Congress and the Senate and the government. So that's why today we actually see Trump is trying to push this vote on redoing Obamacare. The Senate and the House don't have the votes to support him. He's trying to push it to an ultimate vote. But if they vote against it or they don't vote for it, he doesn't have any say in it, the matter. So the big question, though, is a possible referendum. Because what they do internally is less concerned, is can they call for a referendum to leave the EU? Because France is part of the EU. It uses the euro. But France is not that large of an economy that their actions inside of France have that much overlapping or that much effect on the euro. Because don't forget, they don't have a central bank, so it's the ECB. ECB has complete control over them. The euro is controlled by the European Union, and so each country outside of Germany has very little authority, except inside their own borders. But the question is the referendum. Okay. The 1958 Constitution provides for a referenda in both Article 11 and 89, but it requires the president to have the backing of either the prime minister or the majority of both chambers of parliament. The center-right Republicans currently have a majority in the Senate, and half of the upper chamber is up for re-election in September. Now, the only one that would probably try to push for a referendum is Marine Le Pen. Now, what's happening is the global markets are starting to stress. Okay, they're starting to wonder, does she have the momentum to be another Trump? Now, one historical precedent was set. The precedent that Le Pen's supporters cite was the 1962, when then Charles de Gaulle bypassed the parliament to force through a referendum on presidential voting system. De Gaulle, though, had the backing of the prime minister and the cabinet, even though he had sparked a constitutional crisis. Now, the question is, who will the prime minister be? Will they support a referendum? All of this gets very complicated. It's no different than if you watch the UK and what's going on with the Scots. The Scottish can call for this referendum, but it's Theresa May who has to put it on the ballot. Okay. She doesn't want to stop it because then it looks really bad, but it's just not a matter of Scots saying, oh, we want to have a referendum to leave the UK. Now, there's one chink in the constitutional protection, according to Le de Villec, who is one of the well-known constitutional debaters in France. Between the new president's inauguration in May and the new legislature being seated in early July, the president must name a temporary prime minister and has free rein to pick a cabinet. So this is what the worrisome period will be. Will be from the May, and then when the installation of the new president, and then how long it takes to get the new government seated. Now, the elections for new government aren't until June, so there's a very short window. That interim period is when the president could push through a referendum. The old assembly would be called back to debate it, but wouldn't have the power to veto. Still, the 2-month window would likely be too short in practice to organize another ballot. But they could surely start a very active movement. The president has the nuclear codes and once a year can dissolve the National Assembly. Article 16 of the Constitution also gives the president extraordinary powers in times of exceptional crisis, such as an invasion or a domestic insurrection. But other than that, there's very little the president can do on their own. But the fact remains that risk is starting to dominate the European markets. European government bonds continue to fade due to the heightened political risk that has prompted the benchmark French yields to almost double their premium over the German bond. Okay. The yield spread between French 10-year bonds and the same maturity German debt just the highest in more than a week, as anti-Euro candidate Marine Le Pen's momentum has slowed in opinion surveys for a second round election runoff in May against mainstream candidates. Bets that U.S. President Donald Trump may announce stimulus measures in a speech later on Tuesday also weighed on the bonds market. Okay. Now, the market needs to decide whether we are in a big risk of concern about the European Union or not. Elections in Europe are a cause for concern in terms of risk aversion, while there's a risk appetite coming from elsewhere in the U.S. with Trump about to speak. Okay, now, a couple of you guys keep writing in all these questions. First of all, I couldn't tell you a damn thing about India. I don't trade anything in India. I don't do anything in India. And I have no effect how anything in the Eurozone affects India. You have to do that research yourself. Okay. Now, as far as affecting cross currencies, okay, as far as affecting the pound, what we're looking at is stress coming out of the Eurozone. Stress is never good for any currency because traders tend to run to gold or safe havens. They'll run to the yen. Now, if you're saying, somebody asked me, what about against the pound? Well, if an anti-Euro sentiment comes in, okay, or the Eurozone decides, or the EU decides they're going to stake very tight claims and stop anybody else from trying to leave the Eurozone, that means they're going to be much harder on Brexit negotiations. Okay, if that forces a hard Brexit, or they start to see that the Eurozone isn't even negotiating with the UK, the pound's going to go down because the UK still needs to have some type of relationship with Europe. So you all have to look and research all the currencies and the cross assets. Okay, this is only information. Okay, it's a different effect every day, every headline, and in every country. Okay, what's going to happen next week in the UK when Theresa May triggers Article 50? Will the markets panic or will they not panic? Can't tell you. Everybody's prepared for it now. We know what's happening, but how will the markets react when it's officially done? What will the headlines be reading? Because the EU doesn't say much because there's nothing officially happening until they receive the Article 50 letter in the EU. So that's when you're going to start to see and hear, and we're going to start to see the beginnings of negotiations. Now, France within the EU, the French economy represents approximately 15% of the Eurozone GDP. Foreign direct investment in France in 2015 was 44 million US dollars, down from 55, and it slightly declined a little bit more in 2016. Politically, France remains an important decision maker in Europe. The nation elects 74 of the 751 seats in the European Parliament, or close to 10%. Some parliamentary decisions require a simple majority and others require an absolute majority. France has 29 of the 352 votes on the EU Council of Ministers and the 260 votes that are needed for a council majority. The councils of ministers, whose members are appointed by respective EU governments, share legislative responsibility with members of parliament who are elected directly to the EU by EU citizens. So you have to remember, the outcome of this election also sends the representatives to the EU, which then has an effect on the overall attitudes of the Eurozone. So it's not just simply a little tiny election. You know, it's an important election throughout the whole entire Eurozone. Okay, and it could start a larger wave of anti-EU sentiment, or more countries thinking about, or more of these odd candidates, jumping in this populist wave, and you can never predict what or who could get elected. Now, the euro has moved weaker against the dollar in recent years, but as slowing activity in the Eurozone has worked against the single European currency. But even the UK, okay, regards to the value of the currency, it is now the migration, open borders, and dealing with terrorism and migration That is the main concern, and lots of politicians are capitalizing on this. And as I said, as we start this webinar, the biggest fear every time we see another terrorist act, it turns more anti-migration, anti-open borders sentiment. Okay, so this is played right into Marie Le Pen's pocket. Okay, but what's going to end up happening is you're going to see this wave of hardcore anti-immigration, anti-visa, and anti-Middle Eastern nations coming out. So with Trump in office in the U.S., okay, if this happens in France, it's going to turn the whole thing upside down. Okay. Now, while Europe is a large market with nearly 500 million consumers, it has been dogged by chronic physical woes brought on by political structures that have weighed against the region's single currency. A financial crisis in Greece and the threat of crises in other fiscally weak European nations, combined with slow demand in the economy, have forced the European Central Bank to lower rates and institute quantitative easing programs that have discouraged the flow of capital into the region. Now, under the influence of austerity measures, the euro area has managed to reduce its budget deficit in the last 5 years. Despite this and a long period of loose monetary policy at the European Central Bank, growth has remained tepid. And this is what is happening. Is the people in even France, which France isn't doing so horribly, those hurt the most by the weak economy aren't seeing any respite. Okay. The socialist administration of France has been perceived as ineffective in managing the economy. François Hollande has the lowest rating of any president in France, ever in France. Okay, growth in France has averaged less than 1% for much of the same period since Hollande was elected president in 2012. At the same time, French unemployment has run at over 10%. This compares to unemployment rates around 4% in other major European economies like the UK and Germany. Now, the biggest issues on the docket are the incumbent French President François Hollande of the Socialist Party has decided not to run for a second term. A number of candidates have stepped forward to run for the French presidency in 2017. While elections are often unpredictable, French opinion polls so far have indicated some of the possible frontrunners. So again, Hollande was in the front and screwed it all up with this indictment. Marie Le Pen is right on his butt, and Emile Marsan is also floundering, but nobody knows. He's got some popularity, but he doesn't have much of a party. So French political turmoil is hitting the bond market pretty bad. French bond prices fell to their lowest level in 18 months amid fears that the scandal engulfing one-time frontrunner François Hollande could bolster populist candidates in April's presidential election, particularly far-right leader Marie Le Pen. And this is a name you got to watch out for. She's working in the press. She's working the headlines. Now, you know, her father was president of France. Okay. Now, traders have been on edge after they failed to predict the two biggest political shocks of the year: Britain's vote to leave the EU and Donald Trump's election in the U.S. So many investors aren't sure. I mean, like I said, it isn't politics like it was in the old days, where you pretty much knew who's going to win, who was going to lose, and these these little people in the background didn't make headways. They got some votes, but they didn't make headways. Nobody would have ever expected Trump to be president of the U.S. Nobody. Remember what happened in June? Nobody really thought Brexit was going to be voted in. Nobody thought the referendum was going to be to leave the EU. That night, as those polls came in, the markets went crazy. Nobody had even made preparations to how this would be handled if it was a vote to leave the EU. Because everybody was sure it might be close, but they weren't going to leave the EU. Then, all of a sudden, we have the vote to leave the EU. David Cameron steps down. Nobody's got any understanding of how this has to go. What's got to be done next? And still today, all these months later, people aren't exactly sure. People are coming back second thought saying, oh, I didn't really mean for this to happen. I voted for it because it made me feel good, but I didn't think it was going to win. So voters have no idea, or investors have no idea what to expect. Now we see, this is a current chart on the euro. The euro is still trading near a very, very low bottom, except it's propped up only because the dollar has really weakened because everybody's getting stressed out about Trump, and his inability to deliver what he's promised. And now the market is starting to fear that, this Trump rally was all hope but an anticipation of nothing. So the U.S. markets are down. Today is the vote on the health care. Trump has put all of his eggs in one basket. He thinks he can muster, enough votes to get it passed. If he doesn't, it'll actually be it'll be a nail in his coffin for his presidency. So we'll take a look at this. Now, also, we have the ECB. Now, the Eurozone policymakers have pointed to a narrowing of spreads between the German bonds and debt for the more troubled economies as a sign of increased investor confidence of the market crisis fighting policies since the height of the Eurozone crisis in mid-2012. Mario Draghi told the ECB president told lawmakers in Brussels on Monday his central bank did not target spreads between Eurozone sovereign bonds and yields. Now what's happening is, yes, Greek bonds, Portuguese bonds, Italian bonds are leveling out, but they're still paying a much higher return. And because the crisis is more or less past us, investors are buying up bonds with higher rates of return because they now see them as less risky. Because as we see, we haven't seen anything really fail anywhere. The ECB has bailed everything out. Okay. So it is, however, been a hallmark of Mr. Draghi's tenure to narrow the gap. Policies such as quantitative easing, where the central bank purchased debt to lower interest rates, and spur lending have countered what the ECB president describes as the final fragmentation by lowering the cost of credit in weaker economies. Now, because the ECB is buying at an impeccable rate, that most of the bonds are being bought up by the ECB. They're running out of things that they can buy. Now, the widening of spread between Italian and Spanish debt is also being watched closely. While the Spanish economy, the region's fourth largest economy, has staged a recovery in recent years, growth in Italy remains weak, and its banking sector is again besieged, and unemployment remains very, very high and continues to rise. So we have Portugal that's doing better. We have Italy that's doing terrible. Spain is doing much better. Greece is stabilized but still not doing much of anything. And France, which is stable but not really healing. And Germany is starting to pull everything back together and hold everybody up. But this is a big, big pressure on Germany. And France being the second largest economy, the Eurozone needs the backing of the French. Okay. They need the economy of the French to start producing something. The ECB bond buying program designed to push down borrowing rates will be tapered from 80 billion back to 60 billion starting in April. As some banks have suggested, the scheme could come to an end earlier than anticipated in the Eurozone. Inflation continues to beat expectations. That would help drive up the euro. Now, this is not just about politics. It is a confluence of politics and the fact that economic data in the Eurozone has been improving, which makes investors think the ECB might be questioning how much stimulus is still required. Now, the dangers of political integration through crisis. The EU remains a project in progress, said Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European integration, best describes this process in his memoir when he argued that Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. Now, what we're saying is, if the Eurozone can be pulled apart during crisis, I mean, the whole idea is, like in the States, the U.S., it doesn't matter what crisis you have, there's no states leaving the United States of America. If the Eurozone starts crumbling under crises, then it has no value of staying together. So this thing with Brexit is sparking more other countries to think, if there's one or two or three other populist winners who are anti-Eurozone, you'll start to see the Eurozone completely deteriorate. Okay, they need to be able to stay together during crisis to say that they're worthwhile having. It's easy to stay together during good times. Now, the crisis to the Eurozone will be Marie Le Pen. Now, understanding the likelihood of a victory by Le Pen in the French presidential election is complicated by the two-round election system and the fact that the two major political parties have only recently chosen their candidates. However, some facts are quite clear. On the first round, most recent polls are in agreement that Le Pen is expected to win a plurality of votes, worth between 22 and 27% of the total. The contest is between herself, the candidate of the main center-right party, and ex-President Minister Francois Fillon, who gathers about 21 to 28% of the vote, except with this indictment. Okay. Now, after that, we have the independent candidacy of Emmanuel Macron, who is expected to get between 16 and 24%. Okay. But he has virtually no party. The recently chosen candidate of the Social Party, Benoit Hamon, has not figured prominently in most surveys, and his candidacy is in its early stages, relatively speaking. So it is not unsurprising that he comes in fourth place with 6 to 15% of votes. So what's going to come up as we get closer and closer to April 23rd? We're going to see who the second party is going to be, but it looks like that one of the major players will be Marie Le Pen. Okay. Then that's when you're going to see for that next 10 days major stress throughout the European markets, throughout the DAX, the CAC, as well as the euro. Now, should these intentions hold into the first round on April 23rd, then the second round contest will be between Fillon and Le Pen. This is where Le Pen appears to run into trouble as her message fails to appeal to voters beyond the growing but still limited support of her front national base. Not a single poll gives Fillon less than 14% margin of victory over, and more recent polls give him at least 20% advantage. Okay, but it depends, again, on what the French courts do and how fast they do it. Unsurprisingly, the same is true in polls comparing the popularity of Macron with that of Le Pen, giving the young independent candidate a margin of victory of at least 24% and as much as 30%. Now, the question is, can we believe polls? They've been so wrong in the U.S., they were so wrong on Brexit. Can we believe in them? In light of the recent polling failures to accurately predict the results of the Brexit referendum and the U.S. presidential election, some caveats are warranted. It is important to note that as many as 44% of the respondents reported that they would not vote or that they were still undecided according to the latest poll. So the race is far from over. The next 3 months, or the next 2 months now, will determine how much impact the recent corruption scandal engulfing Fillon's campaign and Macron's investment banking past will have on the polling figures. Okay. So now what we have is France's election is shaping up as the most unpredictable in decades, with far-right national frontrunner Le Pen and centrist Emmanuel Macron tied in the polls for the April 23rd first round, while the mainstream left and right language in third and fourth place, with the poll showing Macron 39 would easily beat the anti-immigration Le Pen 48 in a decisive runoff on May the 7th. He had been expected to take the most of the heat in Monday's TV battle or the debate. Former frontrunner Fillon, 63, who has been ensnared in a raft of scandals, said Le Pen's proposal to ditch the euro and bring back the French franc would cause economic and social chaos. And this is a very important thing you have to look at. See, the UK leaving the Eurozone, the UK wasn't part of the euro. So the UK still maintained its own central bank and still had his own currency. So this made it fairly easy, where if France decides to do this, they've got to immediately have a new currency. They've got to have a central bank established. They've got to have, it becomes a huge mess, okay? Because they have a referendum, they start to vote. Will they stay in the euro? Will they want to keep the euro? Will the Eurozone allow them to continue using the euro? And would the ECB continue to be their central bank? So you don't leave the euro and the protection afforded by the European Central Bank for an adventure. That would ruin borrower and savers alike. Fillon, who presented himself as the most experienced pair of hands, scolded Marie Le Pen. Now, millions of voters are still undecided after 5 years of unpopular socialist rule by Francois Hollande, marked by high unemployment, low growth, and a spate of jihadist attacks that killed over 230 people. Fillon may be hoping for a boost Monday after taking a battering over revelations that his wife has paid hundreds of thousands of euros for a suspected fake job as a parliamentary assistant and allegations that he accepted luxury suits from a rich benefactor. Le Pen also goes into the election under legal cloud, accused of defrauding the European Parliament of funds and illegal campaign financing. Communist-backed Mélenchon appeals to voters, reward the virtuous. Okay. Now, the election could hinge on the turnout. Polls show that only 65% of the voters are planning to vote in the first round, and that would be a record low. And the surveys show voters being unusually fickle. Supporters of Mélenchon, who style himself as a progressive, are among the most likely to switch camps, while Le Pen's are seen as the most loyal. The trained lawyer has worked hard to purge the National Front of anti-Semitism and overt racism bequeathed by her father. Jean-Marie Le Pen sent tremors through France in 2002 by beating the socialists to a place in the presidential runoff against Jacques Chirac. In the runoff, voters rallied en masse behind Chirac. Now, we have no idea what's coming. Okay. Somebody just asked, if Fillon wins, will the euro go up? No, it's not going to happen. If Le Pen comes in, the euro will go down. The French, right now, the euro is not down because of France. The euro is down because of economic reasons and huge quantitative easing by the ECB. Okay. France only will stress the markets. When markets get stressed, the euro goes down. But a decisive bad win in France will send the euro farther down. But nobody's going to send the euro up. Okay, it's the euro coming up is going to depend on the overall Eurozone, German economic data, and the ECB. So what you will see going up and relaxing will be the CAC, the stock exchange in France. So on that note, there's a lot to think about, but it's all going to be based on headlines. Now remember, France is only a small portion of the Eurozone. Okay, it only is a matter of the stress it gives to investors. Okay, how much it makes investors uncomfortable. When investors get uncomfortable about anything, they run away from. They run to safe havens. But again, you don't buy and sell the euro. You buy and sell the euro against the currency. So against counter currencies, cross currencies, you have to watch out. Now, again, the CAC is specifically the French stock exchange. But so if you're trading French bonds, you're trading the French stock exchange, they will respond to internal politics. Otherwise, we're going to see the stress of the elections and the possible growth of an anti-EU sentiment throughout the rest of the Eurozone. That's what we're watching for. So thank you very much for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again next week. And just keep an eye on those headlines. I'm going to go over and see that vote supposed to be taking place in the U.S. right now. So I'm going to go see if Mr. Trump has killed his presidency or not, or was he able to pull out this vote. So thank you very much, and have a great weekend now. Bye now.